The ever-present law. I was put in mind of this the other day, not only because this lecture was looming, but because I have a daughter who likes to make cupcakes. And I was presented with a cupcake and another cupcake. And I thought, well, I know I shouldn't, but I think I will. And I thought to myself, well, how often does a thought like that go through my mind? I know I shouldn't, but I think I will. And it did occur to me that I might not be the only person in the universe to have had that sort of thought. In fact, my observation is that it's really quite commonplace, so commonplace that it barely gets remarked on. But actually, thinking about it, I thought, well, what is this I know I shouldn't? Who is this I that knows it shouldn't? And who's this I that thinks I will? And why are they both speaking with the same voice in my mind? And so I thought about this a little bit further, and I thought, well, I know I shouldn't. What is this shouldn't? Who says I shouldn't? Where does that come from? And that was a sort of a starting place, a sort of a sense that, well, there is something in this being, as I think there is in almost any articulate being, that has some knowledge of what is right and what is wrong. Even though there's another voice in there that says, but I'm going to ignore it. And in a way, that little sentence, I know I shouldn't, but I think I will, sums up the dilemma, it sums up in a way the human condition. And it's a condition that has led the human race into all sorts of difficulties, including the present sort of difficulties. So that was a sort of reflection recently on this topic. It just seemed to illustrate it. And I was sort of prompted to address this problem, the question, by all sorts of things one hears about the world that we live in. I was particularly drawn, I got involved in a conversation with an academic in Canada about the world population situation. We're just about 8 billion people now, 7.5 billion, 6.9 billion in 2010. We're now at 7.5, and it's expected to keep going up. Some people say we'll peak, the world population of human beings, that is, will peak at about 9 billion at about the middle of this century, and will then start to decline. But more recent studies are beginning to say, well, actually, there's no guarantee that there will be a peak in the middle of the century, and there's every possibility that the world's human population will go on increasing and increasing and increasing. And there are ever increasingly difficult questions about how that population is going to be able to survive, and to survive without causing irreparable damage to the rest of the environment, what we call the environment, the rest of the world that we live in, to the extent that future generations' possibilities of survival will be compromised. And it seemed to me that, in a sense, there are two ways of coming at this. The world of public policy and policymakers tries to make rules and regulations and tries to regulate our conduct by external factors. But there's another world, which I'll call the world of, I prefer to call it the world of philosophy, but the world of ethics or morals, which looks in completely the opposite direction and asks, well, how can human beings regulate their own conduct so that we don't cause this level of damage. And I think this is a very big and important question, because we find ourselves in a world which kind of expects somebody else to do everything for us. This school was founded, one of its guiding principle really was a love of truth and justice. And the love of truth gives a sort of direction. And I think it was realized very early on that you don't arrive at an absolute truth, which you can then announce to the world, look, we've got it, we've understood, no more problems. It's more of a dynamic that brings you to ask questions and questions and keep questioning your understanding. And as situations change, understanding changes. And there's no kind of received truth or received wisdom that can be handed to you in a sentence or in a book. And then there's this question of justice. And the modern approach to justice is to set up a ministry, isn't it? So now we have a Ministry of Justice. It's a relatively recent invention. I think it was probably set up about 20 or 25 years ago, the Ministry of Justice. In this country, other countries have had ministries of justice for much longer, as though somehow justice is something for which the state is responsible. And we have big arguments, like Mr. O'Toole, I practice in the legal profession, and there are constant questions and arguments about access to justice, and how do you get access to justice, and can we afford access to justice? And those sort of questions are happening all the time. And all of that is born out of an assumption that justice is something that somehow comes to us from out there. That the great, mighty, generous government will somehow dispense justice to us through systems of national health, social security, all of these public provisions. But there is another understanding of justice. It's a very ancient one. I draw it from Plato because in the school we were like to study Plato, which is that justice is a state of the soul. And then the question of access to justice is a question of access to your own soul. And it takes me back to the two little voices and the cupcakes, really. I know that I shouldn't is, in a sense, the voice of justice. And I think that I will is a departure from justice, let's put it that way. So there are these two approaches. Now, one looks at the world and its economy and its arrangements for human provision. I was interested when I was checking the figures on population growth to note that half of that population, that world population of 7.5 billion, occupies for its habitations 1% of the land surface of the earth. I just thought that was an interesting statistic. And it's partly because the argument that I got involved with in the first place was around a question in economics. And the solution that was being proposed and that I objected to was that in order to have a healthy economy, we will have to reduce the world's human population. And I find that a difficult one to swallow. And I tend to respond to people when I'm in my slightly bitter moods by saying, well, are you going to volunteer to go? And I haven't yet had anybody say, well, yes, I'll be first. Yeah. We do get people who consciously and deliberately limit their families, but, you know, reducing the world's human population it seems to me to be fraught with danger, let me put it that way. A policy that says we're going to reduce population by, if necessarily, government regulation. Some time ago now, a few years ago, I heard some learned professors from the University of Beijing explaining the population control policies in China, which they found they had to relax because they've now got a serious problem in that they haven't got enough young people to support an aging population. But it was really quite horrifying the way they had to set about it. Other parts of the world manage it just simply by education and making it possible for people to voluntarily limit the size of families. Well, fine. But really, one also looks at the other side, at the sheer abundance of nature and at the extraordinary responsiveness of nature when human consciousness is applied as part of nature to nature. And even without using all sorts of artificial chemical fertilizers and pesticides and all the rest of it, it is possible for the earth, if it is properly nurtured and cared for, to support substantial populations. Probably much more substantial than we think of. And I also noticed when I was looking at this that approximately 1/3 of all the food that is produced in the world, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations came up with this figure, approximately 1/3 of the food produced for human consumption in the present day, now, this year, is being wasted. In the so-called developing world, it tends to get wasted in the production process. In the more developed parts of the world, if that's the right word, it gets wasted in the consumption process, but it doesn't actually get eaten as food for nourishing human beings. Well, even a little bit of careful attention would, I would expect, reduce that waste substantially and allow that food to go to feed people. And the difficulty is all to do with how it's actually distributed, and in particular, I'm afraid, who owns the land where it's produced, and who owns the distribution systems that distribute it. And that's a matter of economics. Now, in the school, we've studied philosophy and economics for nearly 3/4 of a century. In fact, I think almost exactly 3/4 of a century, 80 years now. 1937 the school was founded. And it's been a collective endeavour. And without departing from what I said at the outset, that you've never arrived at the final answer, over that period of time, it is to be hoped at least that you arrive at some answers which are at least a useful guide. And one of the key philosophic insight which animates the school at the present time is a philosophy of unity. It recognizes, for example, I gave you that little example of I shouldn't have this but I will, and I doubt if there's anybody in the room who didn't recognize it, because it's a common human experience. And every language that I'm aware of has a word for that I. And everybody has an experience of an I. You know, I mean, it's inconceivable, isn't it? That because it's your feeling of actually being a person that exists. And again, one of the things I don't ever hear is people standing up saying, well, actually, I don't exist. Except, actually, at the very finest of philosophy, but then there is another I that absolutely does exist. Where this takes us is to a sense, at least, that every human being partakes of the same existence. We all recognize that we're alive. We have the same life. And nobody's been able to say where it comes from, and nobody's very clear about where it goes. But we all experience being alive. We have life. It is common to us all. In fact, we can see that it's common to all animated creatures. You also see, even in very primitive creatures, a sense that life is to be preserved. They do their best to survive. And so you get the sense that they must also have a sense that they actually do exist. I doubt if it's as articulate as ours. But nevertheless, there is a sense of existence. And that sense of existence, that life that runs through everything that is animate, is one and the same. However much we may wrap our characters around it, it's the same basic thing, isn't it? You know, we all appear totally different. And in that sense, we all are totally different, both in mind and in body. But we experience the same things. We are animated and actuated by the same things. And it does seem to me that the urgent need of the present time is to reactivate the awareness of that commonality of human experience. In order to move away from the sense that somebody else is going to deal with everything for us and bring the responsibility back here where it belongs. And I don't think you can force that. Governments can't enforce it, armies can't enforce it, nuclear bombs can't enforce it. It can only be done by education and understanding, and deepening and developing understanding. And so there's another, I suppose, aspect of being human, which again I think is a bit neglected, and that is that education doesn't stop when you leave college. That education, learning, coming to understand through experience is a lifelong endeavour and a lifelong process, and possibly the principal purpose of a human life. To achieve not a vast knowledge, but a deep wisdom. And it's that, I suppose, that deep wisdom, when you're faced with this little, I know that I shouldn't, but I think I will. There's a discrimination sometimes takes place, just occasionally, don't you find, and you don't. You know what I mean? And it comes from recognizing the relationship between cause and effect. That if I do, there will be consequences, which in the end will be regrettable. And this is one of the other, I think, most important features of the human race, really, is its ability to recognize and relate cause and effect and adapt accordingly. And one of the encouraging signs that one sees in the world is that although we get tidal waves of doom and gloom about the state of the planet and the state of the world and the moral situation and the decline of religion and the awful state of the youth, which I don't think is any more awful than it was when I was a youth, and when quite a lot of people here were youths as well, as far as I can see. But nevertheless, we hear how terrible it all is. But one also sees adaptations taking place. I mean, you remember in the 1960s and 70s, conspicuous consumption was all the rage. You remember there was built-in obsolescence in manufacturing processes, all that sort of thing, so that cars inevitably rusted away after about 7 years, for example. Lots of things were designed to fall apart so that the manufacturers could sell another one 6 or 7 years down the line. And when the popular consciousness woke up to those things, they started to change. And sometimes it was done by regulation, and sometimes it was done simply by the market. Once one car manufacturer recognizes that every other manufacturer is doing this and says, well, we've stopped, we don't do this. This car will last for 10 years. The market drifts towards that car, doesn't it? And then the rest of the industry has to follow. And I certainly take some hope from that. You know, whoever heard of recycling in the 1970s? And again, it's a response to the difficulties that were being caused by a throwaway culture. So one can take some encouragement and enthusiasm, I think, from that. And I think it comes more from this inner understanding and this ability to relate cause to effect. And that's why this title, The Ever-Present Law, came to mind when this lecture was being contemplated. Because it's ever-present in the sense that it's in us. We can't get away from it. You know, Mr. O'Toole and I could probably recite to you extracts from the Theft Act. I doubt if many people here can just pop up and say, the Theft Act says. Can you remind me? Theft is the dishonest appropriation of property belonging to another with the intention of permanently depriving the other of it. Right? But you don't need to know that, do you, to know that you don't steal? The government, the law, has to define these things, the external law has to define these things, because it has to deal with it objectively. But the simple rule, you don't steal, is quite sufficient. Of course, you can then debate, well, what is theft? And again, the government's definition is one thing. I've heard others taking something that is not freely given, for example, is theft to some people. It's a moral standard, though not a legal standard. Taking more than you need to some people is theft. The government wouldn't say that because it wouldn't dare to define what we need. The most it can do is say, well, everybody needs a basic minimum. But if it were to say that anybody who had more than that basic minimum was guilty of theft, it would not be the government for very long in a democratic society, would it? So there is something in us, isn't there, that somehow or other we imbibe, which is a point of discrimination. It's our ethical foundation, if you like. And it's ever present because we carry it with us. Whether there's a sanction for it imposed by a law or government or not. We recognize that you cannot live in a community where theft, for example, is rife, where the strong are free to bully the weak. We recognize that. We don't need the government to tell us that. We may need some help from the government to make sure that the strong don't bully the weak, but we know ourselves that it's not right. And even the bully will have that little sentence, you know, well, I know that I shouldn't, but I can, so I will. I've added a little bit, I can, so I will. I add it because, again, it's one of those things that one meets in the modern world. We can do it, therefore, why shouldn't we? Well, that little other voice that says, I know I shouldn't, is why we shouldn't. We know there's something wrong with it. When you get to genetic manipulation, for example, of natural organisms, well, we can do it. We're just about able to clone human beings. But there's something, I hope that, there's something in me that recoils from that. I find it hard enough to think it's okay with sheep. Cloning human beings, perhaps creating little farms, you know, for organs so that people who get ill because they have done things which they knew they shouldn't do, can replace organs that have been damaged thereby, that sort of thing. It's scientifically possible. But should we do it? So this ever-present law is that in us which says, I know that I shouldn't. And the question then is, well, where does that come from? It's easy to say, well, it's innate. We have an innate sense of justice, an innate sense of fairness. Even young children are heard to cry, it is not fair. But I think there is also the simple fact of what you might call cultural conditioning. The climate of a community which has a moral code, which has standards, which it expects people to maintain, which people expect to maintain amongst themselves. Standards of conduct which are basically acceptable. And if imbibed, if taken in from an early age, they create what we call character. A character that has principles. With the school, we were guided by truth as a concept. In practice, it helps, therefore, to be honest, which is simply the practical application of a sense of truth, a love of truth, even a law of truth, to be honest. It actually has the most profound implications. I'm sure you know the difference of a situation where you can assume, rightly or wrongly, but you can at least assume that the people you're with are honest. So if you say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to pay you that, or whatever, you know that people are being honest and you can expect them to deliver on what they said. And the situation where you can't trust anybody. And believe me, the legal profession, with which I'm very familiar, makes a fortune out of the assumption that you can't trust anybody. And so we write down contracts in minute detail, and often in minute writing, just to make sure that if people don't do what they say they do, you have some comeback. And all of the whole legal profession would go if we could wipe out violence and dishonesty. Well, what about violence? To the best of my understanding, all leading religions and philosophies advocate peace. There is, of course, what you would call the church militant, which is militant in the persuasive sense, but doesn't normally, in normal times, advocate violence as a way of life. And indeed, violence as a way of life is very difficult. The whole essence of humanity, isn't it, is cooperation. Partly for protection, partly for just decent living, security of living, indeed well-being. So you come up against another thing. I don't know if there are many drivers here. There aren't many audiences where there aren't some drivers. And one occasionally experiences something which can occasionally manifest as what's called road rage. And most people manage not to give undue vent to it. Occasionally some people spill over and they end up in the courts and in trouble. But we also have in us something that will control it, don't we? We don't need a policeman standing there. We just don't do it. We don't let go because you just don't do that sort of thing. And again, that's part of that inner law, isn't it? That inner sense of, I suppose, responsibility, of humanity, and of appreciation, even in the dimmest way, that the person at the other end of this may also be a human being, who may also have had a hard day, and may not have actually meant what they just did or said. So all that brings us back, doesn't it, to our personal responsibility. It makes sense of the statement that the best form of government is self-government. But it does mean that we have to have some sense, some agreement as to what principles are going to apply. I've suggested truth because it brings about honesty, peace or non-violence, because it's very difficult to live without it. And all of these are really restraints. They're restraints on that voice that says, but I will, anyway. Because the this seems to be the very key. We have this great power as human beings. We can do it, we use it for all sorts of things. But it does need to be directed and restrained. And it's not often, although it can be, it's not often a command. You must do this, you shall do this. It's just, no, I shouldn't, so I won't. And the need, I suppose, is to cultivate that inner voice, articulate that inner voice, and make it known. And make it known that we all, as human beings, have a responsibility to heed that inner voice. Discussing this a little while ago, the golden rule was mentioned. Do unto others as you would that they would do unto you. And I was reminded of an observation in Winston Churchill's History of the English-Speaking Peoples. There are not many things in that vast work, incidentally, which anything would remind me of, but I do remember he spoke about King Alfred the Great. And he said of Alfred the Great that he inverted the golden rule, do unto others as you would that they should do unto you. And for purposes of law turned it into do not do unto others what you would not have them do to you. And again, it's that message of restraint, isn't it? And it's been the foundation of the common law and the developing freedom of the English-speaking peoples since the days of King Alfred. Do not do unto others what you would not have them do to you. It's quite a good rule. And not always easy to live by, but easier than do unto others as you would that they would do unto you. And less directive, less of a command. One then starts to ask what qualities, what principles would one actually cultivate? And if you range around the cultures and philosophies and religions of the world, you'll find dozens. So the most that one can suggest is a few that might be helpful. And the authority for them is not that they come from a religion or a philosophical inquiry or a government, but because they, in a way, they come from being human. And that's their only authority, that it's how human beings behave towards each other, out of respect for each other, and the expectation that one would respect others as one would have them respect you. But if you are going to expect people to respect you, you have an obligation to command that respect through your conduct, through the way you engage with them and society. And I don't think you need a religion to tell you that, do you? It's just common sense, in a way. One plays around with these things. One asks, well, what is perhaps most helpful? And everyone will come up with their own list. But one would hope that there's some common ground within that list which makes it possible for us to live together. I've suggested truth, I've suggested peace or non-violence. Kindness is one that I like to keep in mind, just in the way that you behave towards people. Because I like people to be kind to me. So why would I expect not to be kind to others? It's really a matter of simple good manners, isn't it? And you can do a lot with simple good manners. I've got a list here. Restraint, which I've spoken about, self-control, so that we don't just run around doing what we like, but act out of respect. These things need to be cultivated, and as I said earlier, go on being cultivated, because understanding and wisdom can develop throughout life. It doesn't arrive magically with the degree being conferred at the age of 22. I like to think generosity is an important principle. Generosity of spirit, even if you don't have any material goods to be generous with. It's still quite a useful principle. We live in this extraordinarily abundant universe. It's abundant in the material sense. It's full of beauty. It has amazing capacity to respond to our attention. Why not be generous with it? But more important, we have the capacity to come to understand things, to know things. Why not be generous with that? Whoever was impoverished by giving away what they know, or understand, or sharing it. Generosity of spirit, kindness of heart, that sort of generosity. And with it, of course, love. Whoever became impoverished by loving more. There is nothing to lose, so why not be generous with it? Now, that's all very well. So far, I've talked about human beings and our relations with each other. But what has become deeply apparent over the last 50 years or so is that we are not alone. That we as a human race are part of a much greater community of living creatures on this planet and part of this planet. And in a sense, it is part of us. We breathe the same air, as someone famously said. We eat the same food. It comes from the same earth. We're dependent upon these things. There's a great interdependence because the earth, even the air, responds to us, just as we respond to it. We're part of a much greater unity than just the human race. And there's a real need now to really appreciate the importance of this. And that these principles of conduct, which are innate in any civilized community, as between people, really needs to be extended to the whole living world. It has to be, because it's the same life, we depend on it, and to a large extent it depends on us. We are not apart from creation, we are part of creation. All sorts of recent initiatives have taken place that invite, that come under the general heading of harmony with nature. And there are all sorts of ways of coming at this. Deeply spiritual ways through meditation and spiritual practices of that kind, through yoga practices and those sort of things, help to put one in touch with a deeper, wider world. There are obviously material things, just knowing more about it. Time and again, I've said in this room and in other places, if you want to start to connect with things, grow something. And I say it time and again because more people have said to me, do you know you said grow something? It's been really helpful. And it is. It connects you with the earth, its astonishing powers. It connects you with the seasons. It connects you with the interaction between earth and water and air. Because if you don't water the plants, I'm afraid you won't be growing something for very long. And it connects you with it. If you grow some food, you will appreciate just how skilled these people who grow food are. Especially if you try to keep pests off without pesticides. It's all a learning process. It's a way of connecting. And it's part of how you develop the necessary consciousness which will enable the human race to live for as long as may be within the resources of the planet without causing irreparable damage. And once again, we have to have these little sentences in mind. I can do this. Does that mean I should do this? How much of this planet do I need? Why isn't it being shared with, why is 1% of the planet being occupied by half of the human population? I think there must be a story there, because there are chunks of the planet which are not even the land surface of the planet, which are simply not habitable. There are other chunks which do not respond very quickly or easily to human demands for growing food and so on. So that kind of narrows down the available space. But the fact is that 1% is being packed into cities. We're now in a situation where half the global population of human beings lives in cities. And part of the problem with that is that cities do not invite that necessary connection with nature. And that's why a special effort is needed, particularly amongst city dwellers, to make that connection, to really understand this interdependence, so that we start to treat the whole planet, the whole living organism that we're part of, with the respect that it needs and deserves, and indeed is necessary simply for the survival of the human species and all the other species. And we know, or at least the scientists keep telling us, that we're in what they call the sixth mass extinction, the phase of the sixth mass extinction of species. In the last, is it 4.5 billion years that this planet has been in existence, there have been 6 periods when there have been sudden massive extinctions. The last one disposed of the dinosaurs and was associated with a dramatic climate change that no one's quite sure of the cause of. But we're losing species now at an astonishing rate, according to the scientists. And a lot of that is to do with turning over the land surface of the planet to produce food and other products for human beings. We lose biodiversity by creating vast forests of single species to produce wood for furniture and things like that. We turn grasslands, which again have a remarkable biodiversity, into wheatlands which don't. That sort of thing reduces and makes life difficult for all sorts of species who are all part of this wondrous creation that we live in. Now, I don't know how necessary these things are, but they are there, and we didn't put them there. And it's a great arrogance, isn't it, to say, but it doesn't matter, we can take them away, just because we can, just because it suits us. I won't go into, at least I'll mention, but I won't go into the extent to which corporate interests develop this. If you are interested, there are fascinating studies on the way that seeds are being bought up and patented across the globe by a handful of corporations. And in the European Union, for example, there is a list of seeds which you can sell in garden shops. And if your seeds are not on that list, you can't sell them. So that the central authority controls what seeds are available, and it's quite a small list. Traditionally, agriculture and horticulture have survived on people nurturing and exchanging seeds. It's one of the ways by which biodiversity is maintained. And you find the ones that are best for a particular place. You can hybridize and so on in ways which are natural. And the naturalness, I think, shows in the fact that hybrids tend to go back to their original over time, over generations. But that whole system, which is really what our food system depends on, is being bought up largely by pharmaceutical companies, I'm told, because they sell the fertilizers and the pesticides. And the diversity of seeds and the ability to change is one of the means by which the whole resilience of the horticultural, agricultural process is made possible. They prefer to do it by selling chemicals. Now that's a cynical view, it's a one-sided view, and I invite you to treat it with caution, but there is quite a lot of scientific evidence that it is actually going on. So out of that, one tries to develop some principles to build an economic system on. And it's not going too far to say that the economic system, the conceptual economic system that governs the world's economy does not take this into account. There are attempts to do so. There's a branch of economics, for example, called environmental economics, but it concerns itself most with trying to mitigate the damage caused by the system as it exists. It doesn't seem to concern itself very much with actually questioning the system as it exists. It just says, well, we'll put a tax on pollution. We won't stop the polluting activity, we'll tax the pollution. That will put the price up and it'll make sure that the cost of cleaning up the mess is met out of the cost of the product. That's the sort of idea. But much more fundamental things are needed than that. It needs to be a principle of economics that the scale of industrial, agricultural processes is related to the basic materials that it needs, so that there is time for replenishment. Now that, again, we all know that there is, for example, an awful lot of evidence that fossil fuels sooner or later will run out. They get more difficult to obtain. They get more expensive as a result. And what we see is, again, a response from the human race which says, okay, we better start to shift. And it's very promising because it is happening. There is a shift taking place, and a struggle, a battle going on between the interests involved. It does seem to be necessary to base one's economics on a sense of membership of a much wider community of life, membership of a club that you want to continue, if you like. And again, the standard approach to economics is to say, well, it's all here, we can make the best, we can make use of it. There's nothing to stop us. If the sort of inner attitude that is being suggested was fully developed, this, I know that I shouldn't, would become much stronger. We know that we shouldn't, but we do it anyway. Would stop, or at least it would be substantially reduced. It's in that way, I think, it's by bringing these concepts into the whole understanding of economic life, political life and government that we can begin, well not begin, we can continue to meet the challenges of an age which could, and in through some lenses does, promise nothing but doom and gloom. I actually think it's quite optimistic, because all that's really being asked is to remind people of what they really are. We're all human beings. And being a human being is something really rather amazing. We're capable of love. Just think about that. Not just a little bit of love, huge love. Love for the whole of humanity. Love for the planet. I carefully don't bring religion into this discourse because it's too controversial and it's not necessary. I don't wish to discount religion because it can cultivate just that love. That's what it's there for, it seems to me. But for the argument that's being advanced, first of all, it needs to be advanced on a planetary scale, which means it cannot rely on one religion or another. And the only way I can get around that is to rely on philosophy, And some people would say, well, you're turning philosophy into a religion, aren't you? So can we just sort of park that one and say, as human beings, we have these qualities. The capacity to love, the capacity to reason, the capacity to discriminate, the capacity of foresight, the capacity to adapt our own conduct, to decide not to do things that we could do because we shouldn't, the capacity to speak and communicate ideas. These are amazing things. They are really what we are as human beings. We have the capacity for kindness and generosity. And we grow and develop as human beings when we exercise those capacities, don't we? And we recognize as great human beings the people who have and do have those qualities and do develop them. We have the power of courage that enables us to face difficulties even when they seem to be overwhelming. So I hope I've expressed in an hour or so what the study of philosophy and economics in the school has led us to so far. We've only been going for 80 years. It's a tiny blip in the history of humanity. What I do think I have come to understand is that every generation needs to rediscover these things. You can't just pass it on. We can't just replay this record to the next generation and the one after that and the one after that, because somehow or other it has to be rediscovered and built into experience. But the possibility needs to be articulated, and so I do my best. Thank you very much.